Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. Today, I'm here with a fellow YouTuber, Lawrence Anton. He has a YouTube channel on antinatalism, and that's basically what we're going to discuss today. Antinatalism and also some other ideas, topics associated with antinatalism, or some of the ones people tend sometimes to associate with antinatalism. So, Lawrence, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to everyone.
No, thanks so much for inviting me. And I've seen quite a few episodes of The Dissenter, so now I'm on the other side. I usually watch, but now I'm on it.
Yeah, that's great. So let me just ask you, perhaps I will start with a more personal question. What got you into antinatalism? And when did you first get across antinatalism and why did it interest you?
Yeah. Well, the first time I came across it as like a term and an idea was, I guess, around sort of like 6.5, 7 years ago now. And I was on a study exchange in Sweden. I'd recently become vegan, gotten involved in vegan advocacy or animal rights activism. And I was at an animal rights demonstration, or it was just after the demonstration, and I overheard two people having a conversation about antinatalism, but I wasn't involved in that conversation. That's just where I heard like the term and the fact that it was an idea. It was then a few months later, I was at another animal rights demonstration, and there were a few people I was talking to there. The topic then came up, and I was like, "Oh, that was that weird thing that I was kind of interested by, that I'd heard a few months before." So then I had a full conversation with them, and they were antinatalists themselves. They explained it to me. I sort of asked them some questions, gave them a bit of pushback, and then they sent me away with a few sort of links to interviews to watch. So I watched those, and after that, I felt that I didn't have any good counter arguments, and so I adopted it as a view myself. Why it was appealing to me, I'm not entirely sure. The only thing I can say is that because I'd recently become vegan at the time, that had been a big paradigm shift in the way I thought. So I think that made me, particularly then, although I think I've maintained quite an open mind since then, but definitely around that period, I was very open to being completely wrong on fundamental things because I'd found something that I felt I was wrong on before. So I was probably more open than the average person, or than I generally am. So that probably made me more sort of open to antinatalism, even though it was something I'd never heard before. And when I first heard it, I was kind of like, I found it very bizarre because I was very much the opposite. I definitely wanted children. So it was very strange to me to hear that opposing point of view. But yeah.
Oh, so before you got into antinatalism, you wanted to have children and then that changed? Is that it?
Yeah, exactly. I I probably wasn't much different from many other people. It's, of course, it's very normal for people to want to have kids and that to be one of the sort of main things they want to do in life. So it was very much like that. I don't think I would stand out from other people in that respect, but it was a big shift. And when I started to grapple with antinatalism, there was a bit of emotional sort of friction there because obviously it was pulling me away from something that I wanted to do and was a big part of what I saw my future to be. So there was a bit of emotional discord there, but I don't want to overplay it. I actually think I had a relatively smooth transition because once I feel something to be ethically wrong, my emotions tend to come in line with that pretty quickly, and because I just feel like, oh, I don't want to do that anymore. So yeah.
And you mentioned veganism and that you were already a vegan back then. So did you link immediately veganism with antinatalism, or did it take some time for you to notice that perhaps there were some commonalities there in terms of, for example, how we approach sentient life and
Mm.
suffering and stuff like that?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, initially, the my sort of coming across antinatalism and being convinced by it, it occurred in like a vegan environment, but I don't think I necessarily linked it to veganism particularly.
Okay.
It's only been since then, over time, I've become more aware of the links between them. Initially, because when I was having conversations with people about veganism and antinatalism, separate conversations, you would often get the same kind of responses back. So that was quite, like appeals to things being natural and stuff like this. Or, we have reproductive systems, we have canines, these sorts of things. There are sort of similar pushbacks you get on both. So that kind of made me think, well, maybe there's an actual link between these two, between these two ideas or philosophies. So, and my current understanding is that I do think there's a strong link between them. I don't think one necessarily mandates another, but I think in practice, like if one person accepts one in practice, there's a pretty strong case to accept the other. I'm not sure if there's a logical sort of like bridge between them in terms of if one, you have to do the other, but I think there's a very, very strong relationship.
Yeah, no, there are some very curious things that you mentioned there. And I mean, I'm not sure to what extent I'm going to talk here today about my own personal position on antinatalism and veganism. I think I will try to save most of it for an upcoming interview with Amanda Sukenik. She's going to interview me in October.
Oh, nice.
So maybe I will save, I will try to save as much as I can for that. But I mean, for example, at a certain point you mentioned that, and I asked you directly about it, that it was only after you got into antinatalism that you eventually decided you no longer wanted to have kids. In my personal case, it's very interesting because it was way before me getting across antinatalism that I had already decided I didn't want to have kids. Basically,
Right.
when I was 10 years old, I already didn't want to have kids. So.
Yeah. Yeah, I find that like that is something that is relatively common in antinatalist circles, and I think it's probably because if someone's already decided that they don't want children, then like I think one of the biggest barriers to people thinking clearly about antinatalism is that it's telling them something they deeply want to do is ethically wrong. But if you don't want to do that thing, then it kind of makes the thinking process easier. There's less emotional friction. So it's not uncommon to hear that sort of story.
Yeah, and also you mentioned that when you get across ethical ideas that you can't really dispute or don't have good enough counter arguments to, you basically just very quickly adopt them. And for me, it's more or less the same. For example, I was also vegan for 4 years. I mean, the reasons why I stopped being vegan are mostly health related. I won't get into that here. But anyway, I decided that I would become a vegan one day, and the next day I was already eating vegan. So.
Yeah, I was exactly the same. Like my shift was overnight, and I think, I don't know, maybe it doesn't happen with every topic, but like generally, if I find something to be wrong, I sort of have, I don't know, like and it accords with some behavior I'm doing or want to do, then I don't know. I just get a lot of internal cognitive friction.
Yeah, me too. So, but let me ask you now then, what version of antinatalism do you espouse? Because there are slightly different versions out there. Perhaps the most well-known or the most popular is the one by David Benatar. But basically, how would you characterize or describe your own version of antinatalism?
Yeah, so when I first had sort of significant conversations about antinatalism, they were primarily based around, or as I was discovering antinatalism, most of it was centered around the work of David Benatar and like interviews he's given and stuff. And I would say, So I think there's a difference between the form of antinatalism that I find most resonates with me and the form that would be most convincing to others, because obviously different people are going to be convinced by different things. But the form of antinatalism that resonates most with me is the antinatalist conclusion that can be derived from the axiological asymmetry that Benatar describes. And yeah, he also espouses like a sentiocentric form of antinatalism. So I think that antinatalism is about moral agents creating sentient beings, basically moral patients, I guess you'd describe it as. So I know obviously there's much debate in antinatalist circles about whether the reproduction of wild animals is included within antinatalism. I don't know if you wanted to touch on that later, but that I see as something separate. I see antinatalism as being about the behavior of individuals who can make decisions and analyze them in a moral way, right? So it would include breeding of wild animals if it's humans breeding them, say for conservation efforts or something like that. The reason I extend it to other animals, I mean, I have a more detailed video on my channel, but in general, it's because I think in many of the ways that humans can be harmed, other animals can also be harmed in those same ways. Not every way identically, but I think other animals are sentient, feel pain. They have, to different degrees, emotional lives, and these are the things that we tend to care about in humans. And so I think our care should bridge the species barrier over to other species outside of our own species. And so just as like with veganism, I'm against, killing a person for a sandwich, I'd be against killing an animal for a sandwich. Yeah. And it's the same with antinatalism. Just like I'd be against breeding a human, I'd be against breeding, a pig or a cow or a chicken. So yeah, if you want me to cover how I see antinatalism in any more detailed way, just prompt me with a question, but that's sort of like an overview.
Yeah, great. No, and since you mentioned the asymmetry argument, I would like to get into that. I have this question saved for later, but perhaps let's go ahead with it now. Actually, the asymmetry argument is one argument that when I first got across Benatar's work was very convincing to me, but over time, I think that it is actually weaker than it sounds when you first hear it. Because I mean, basically, and also for the audience to know, the asymmetry argument is basically about the some of the asymmetries that we see between being alive and never ever and never even having started alive, never existing. And so sentient beings who are alive, they experience pleasure and pain. Pain, of course, is bad, pleasure is good. And then if you were never even born to begin with, you don't experience any pleasure nor any pain. The pain is good for you to not experience. The pleasure, I mean, since you don't even exist, it basically doesn't matter. I mean, it's more or less along those lines, right? Yeah. So, but one thing that I find a bit weird now is that when we are talking about a person or another kind of sentient being who never existed to begin with, it sounds a bit weird because we're basically talking about, we're not talking about anyone, right? I mean, not existing. It's not. I mean, let me try to explain it in another way. So, I mean, if someone doesn't exist, I understand she wouldn't experience pain or pleasure, but there wouldn't be anyone to not experience that pain and that pleasure. So it's more that I nowadays think that it sounds a bit weird to me to talk in those terms, and also for other people who are not even convinced by antinatalism or haven't been exposed to antinatalism, it would also sound like a weird argument to basically to be talking about things that aren't even there, someone who doesn't exist, but at the same time as the benefit of not experiencing pain. So I don't know if I was clear here. I mean, my argument is a little bit convoluted, I think.
Yeah. No. So I actually, when you started speaking, I actually thought you were going to go down a slightly different road because one thing I've found when I've spoken to people about the axiological asymmetry is that often it pretty much comes down to what, like, the intuitions and the values that the person holds anyway. So I've found that if someone already has the values described by the axiological asymmetry, it provides a sort of very neat way of describing the values that they may not have been fully able to like intellectualize in their head. And that was probably the case for me and probably the case for many antinatalists. But if someone doesn't already have those values, I'm not sure how strong, apart from like presenting someone with the consequences of their values and seeing if they change as a result of that, it's quite hard to change someone's fundamental values. So I've found that the axiological asymmetry argument is both like strong and weak in the same time. Like it's strong in terms of like it provides a very what was the word I even used before? I literally just said it 30 seconds ago. It provides a neat way of someone understanding the values they have and consequences that it and sort of positions or consequences it may lead to. But as using it as a tool to convince someone, I don't know how good it is, because often it bottoms out in, because like Benatar says, it's not a logical argument you can use to catch someone out, like making an illogical argument on their end. It's more just presenting, here's a set of values. If you have them, it likely leads to this consequence, i.e. antinatalism. But if someone doesn't have those values, it can be very hard to move them from that position. So that's the weakness I've sort of seen in it. And at the end of the day, it's like, I'm kind of fine with that personally. Like, I don't feel, one person can only do so much. If I don't convince one person, I can just move on to the next person, etc. Or try use a different argument. But on what you're saying about how it's a strange argument to use because it's talking about the absence of pain being a good thing, even whilst there's no one there to actually actively benefit from that good. I agree with you. I think that I think it sounds very strange, but I think there are, and I think that's because the way that we've evolved to deal with things that are physically around us and not philosophical discussion. And it can often be hard for us to sort of have discussions around things that don't exist or never exist. That's why many people will struggle to deal with hypotheticals, right? When you're having a discussion. I think many of us in the antinatalist sphere, or people who are sort of like interact with the antinatalist sphere, we can often be quite used to having philosophical discussions. But if you go out and try to have a philosophical discussion with an average group of people, and you present a hypothetical, they will say, well, that can never happen, so why are we even discussing it? But that's the point of a hypothetical. That's the whole point. This thing is hypothetical. It's not real. So I agree with you. It can sound very weird. I do think, though, and I think Benatar makes this point in that even though something may sound very strange, if there's a if you're talking about a case which is a peculiar case, a very strange case, even though something sounds weird, it doesn't mean that it's necessarily wrong. I can give like another peculiar case of something being good where there's no one in particular who may be benefiting from it, which is death sometimes, right? Like, I'm sure I don't know what your particular views are, or if you've interviewed people on this topic. I'm sure you have. But those who advocate for like euthanasia or assisted dying, often we will refer to it as being, someone maybe being better off dead. If they're in a situation where their life is extremely bad and there's no sort of prospect for recovery, it doesn't sound strange to me to say that that person is better off dead, because the situation that is currently in existence, pertaining to them, is so bad that simple non-existence would be a better state of affairs. It would be a good thing. The action of helping them fade out of existence, obviously via ethical means, would be a good thing, even though that person no longer exists to actively benefit from that. And I kind of feel like the opposite case of never bringing someone into existence, for me, the language doesn't sound strange. Maybe originally it did. I can't really remember in detail, but it doesn't sound strange to me to say that it's good not to bring someone into existence to suffer. I can maybe give like another quick example in that.
Sure.
And this one's like a vegan example. So it's very common for, if you're doing vegan street outreach and you're presenting some footage of a farm or a slaughterhouse, and you say to the people, we need to just stop breeding these animals and this issue will go away. And the people will say, well, then they won't, come into existence. They won't have lives, and, they'll never live a life. And vegans will say, yeah, good. That's it. That's a good thing that they won't come into existence, because their lives will just be hell. And I think in that instance, it doesn't sound so unintuitive, because we recognize their lives are going to be so bad. I think it's maybe the fact that when we say it's good for a human not to come into existence, perhaps it sounds less intuitive, because the life we're imagining them to have is not as bad as being on a factory farm. And so perhaps there's not as much of a contrast for us to understand the use of the language within. But personally, for me, I see it as equally valid. I don't know if that's going to be convincing to you or other people, but yeah, that's what I have to say.
I mean, you don't have to convince me, because I'm already an antinatalist.
Yeah.
It's just that there are certain specific arguments like that one that to me sound now a bit weird. But anyway, another thing that is also kind of goes together with that argument, the asymmetry argument, is evaluating life as good or bad, or evaluating something as negative or positive. Do you really think that we can do that objectively? I mean, that we can objectively say that whatever it is we're talking about is absolutely negative or absolutely positive or absolutely good or bad? Because, I mean, from my own perspective, and this is also a perspective I developed over the years with some of the conversations I have on the show, it seems to me that different people have different personality traits, different psychological predispositions, and what is good for someone could be bad for another person, and vice versa. So do you think that, what do you think about that, and do you think that matters when it comes to antinatalist arguments?
Yeah. So I agree with you in that. I think our experience of our own lives is, of course, subjective. I mean, I guess by definition, right? Because we are the subject experiencing it. But also in the case of, like, as you said, the same thing can happen to two different people, and they can experience it in very different ways, right? So I think when we're talking about sort of like the human condition, or it's also being called the human predicament in the sort of pessimistic evaluation of human life, I think it is sometimes hard to make objective claims about the nature of human existence, or even or maybe it's even harder with an individual human's existence. One, because we're not experiencing that existence, so it's very hard to make statements about someone else's life because they're the only one experiencing it. So yeah, I think to a degree it is subjective, because There's a saying which I'm probably going to butcher, but it's something like the same person never crosses the same river twice, because either the river has changed or the person has changed. In that, we all live our lives, and perhaps we'll go through an experience, and if we're to go through that experience, we generally change as a person as a result of that experience. And so if we have the same experience in 10 years' time, we won't be experiencing it as the same person, because we'll have grown from the first time, but also there's just the intervening period where other things would have happened and we would have changed. And so, relating this back to, the evaluation of human existence being subjective, is if we can't even guarantee that the same individual will react to the same stimuli in the same way two different times in their life, then it would be extremely hard to make accurate sort of pronouncements about many different people's experience of their life. So I 100% agree that to an extent, the evaluation of our own lives is subjective. And I do struggle with the idea of, because I hold a more pessimistic evaluation of the human condition, but I do have discomfort with going to someone and trying to convince them that their life is worse than they think it is. No, you're mistaken. Your life is actually not as good as you think it is. Your life is actually very bad. Now, I do think there are things we can present to people to make them evaluate their life in a more rational way. But at the end of the day, it's very hard to me as another person make hard and fast statements about their experience and their condition, because I'm not living it. They're the ones living it. And people will have different hedonic set points, for use of a better, or to use a sort of simpler term, like we all have different baselines. Some people have a lower baseline. Some people have a higher baseline for their general mental well-being. So, but just to cover, so I just want to cover, maybe just put a very brief case for why I do generally take a pessimistic evaluation of the human condition, and then I can talk about the link to antinatalism. And I'm actually working on a video at the moment on this very topic. So one reason I take the pessimistic evaluation of human life is because I think, and Benatar describes this, and I'm sure other sort of like philosophical pessimists have, is that there are many asymmetries besides the axiological one that we were talking about, but there are many asymmetries in life that weight our experience towards being more inclined to ill-being rather than well-being. So Benatar presents some examples of, like, the worst pains are worse than the best pleasures are good. Generally, dissatisfaction and pain can come to us naturally with no effort of our own, us putting no effort in. So one easier example is if we were just to sit here existing, like malnourishment and thirst would obviously come to us naturally. We don't have to put any effort in for that stuff to come to us. Eventually we may become infected by a disease as well. Disease finds its way to us. We don't have to go seek it out. But we have to put effort in to stave off these things. So we have to put effort into finding food in the modern context that generally means working a job. Obviously the same with water. With disease, obviously, we need to practice like regular hygiene and things like this, and be wary about the environments or people we surround ourselves with. So there are those asymmetries. Obviously, there's a few others. So there's also an asymmetry of, like, injury can befall us very quickly, or we can lose knowledge very quickly with a blow over the head. But generally, if we're going to recover from an injury, that often takes a lot longer than sustaining the injury. Accumulating knowledge takes a lot longer than our ability to lose it. Like, if you don't actively put effort into revising things and remembering things, you can just forget things. You can put, like, many of us can probably relate to this idea of, like, in the past, maybe 10, 15 years ago, we used to be really knowledgeable about a specific thing, and we used to know all the facts and figures around it. And just the fact that we don't retain that knowledge, it's not like once we get it, it's there. Over time, you lose it, and you have to actively put effort into revising your knowledge and updating your knowledge to maintain that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there's there's a few other things in there, but it kind of strays off the topic. To relate it to antinatalism, though, I think the pessimistic evaluation of human life and it being subjective, I think it is important to antinatalism because it's part of what informs us viewing coming into existence as a harm. If life was so amazing and it was extremely hard to understand it in a way that was pessimistic, then maybe the case for antinatalism would be much weaker. But I'm hesitant. That doesn't mean that it's as relevant for us who already exist. So some of us actually get meaning from studying philosophical pessimism, and we find it relatable and we enjoy discussing it and reading about it. But whether we should be going out and trying to convince people of philosophical pessimism in that, you should evaluate your life to be much worse than it actually is, that would probably do more harm to that person than benefit. The one benefit that could come, obviously, is that they may have a more rational sort of approach to understanding the human condition, or rational as I see it anyway. And so that would maybe reduce the chances that they'd bring other people into existence. But yeah, in terms of like getting everyone to be a pessimist, I'm not sure that's the best way to go because, probably lead to more people having less good lives. But yeah.
Yeah, I was also thinking that when advocating for antinatalism, or for example, if you are on the street approaching people to tell them about antinatalism, I mean, one reaction that I see a lot is if you tell people, or if you try to argue that life is objectively bad. I mean, there are lots and lots and lots of people out there that just don't agree with that at all because they don't have that kind of experience. And I mean, here it doesn't even matter much. I think if it's because they are just they are just forgetting more easily the bad things that happened in their lives. I mean, like the Pollyanna effect and stuff like that, or if it's really that they subjectively have experienced things as mostly good instead of mostly bad. And I think that it would probably be better to, instead of trying to use the objectivity argument, to just tell people, hey, look, whenever someone is born, we're basically tossing a coin because you don't know where it will land. The person can have, for example, depression, can suffer from other kinds of mental illness, or have very, very negative experiences in their life. So I think that would be more convincing, that just tell people that there are many people out there, and this is 100% true, for whom life is not worth it, and they would have been better not being born even to begin with. So
that's basically sort of the risk argument that you'd bring up to someone in antinatalism. And I agree with you. I've done this when I've had sort of like limited experience doing outreach on the street around antinatalism. And yeah, of course, a lot of the people you will come across, I do it in central London. A lot of the people you come across, will not have the same experience of life as, maybe either of us, right? So, but basically everyone knows someone who's had quite a bad life, or they're at least aware of the fact that some people around the world, or many people around the world, will have bad lives. Personally, I haven't met anyone that hasn't acknowledged that. And so then, you can put, like you said, you can put forward to them, well, given the fact that with every new generation we create, obviously the child you're creating being part of that, some of those are going to bear the burden of those really bad lives, so that you can create all the others that are going to have good lives that, they never existed to want in the first place. But the only time, or not the only time, but the main pushback I get on that is generally from a religious perspective. So often, if I'm talking to someone who's an atheist or just more secular minded, they will recognize, yeah, okay, yeah, when you're procreating, you are taking a risk. But when I've spoken to religious people, and at Speaker's Corner, where myself and some others have done some antinatalist outreach, it's quite heavily dominated by religious people, predominantly Muslims, but there are Christians and Jews. But when I speak to people from those religious perspectives, especially Islamic preachers, what they tend to say in those cases is that, well, those people who have very bad lives, it's still a benefit to them because they're living in God's image. They're basking in the glow of God. And if even if they have bad life, if they die as children, they're going to go to heaven anyway. There's a lot of sort of glorification of the death of children, which I've said to them, like, look, if you get to a point where the ideology you follow glorifies the death of children, maybe you want to reconsider. But yeah, I've found in a religious context, even the acknowledgement that some lives are bad, that doesn't tend to hold any sway. But I think then you're in a whole nother ballpark, because you've got to then convince someone that, the sort of whole reality of the universe as they understand it is not the case. And that's obviously very difficult to do. And that's a separate conversation you've got to have with them.
Yeah, sure. And I mean, I was also mentioning that, or trying to tackle that issue, let's say, because it seems to me pretty obvious that for some people it's much easier for them to, when they come in contact with antinatalism, accept it right away because of their own personal experiences, because of the way they experience life, because they have gone through a lot of bad things in life, or they suffer from an illness, something like that. Then someone for whom, when she or he thinks about their own life, they look at it as mostly positive. I mean, when they are confronted with an argument like life is objectively bad, or there's objectively more pain than pleasure in life, I mean, they're just not going to accept it, because they're going to say, okay, that might be true for some people, but it's not for me. So
yeah, it doesn't accord with their experience of reality. Yeah.
So let me ask you now about death, because I know also that there are different views on death among antinatalists. I mean, the way that you relate to pro-mortalism, for example. But what is your idea on it? What are your ideas on it? Because I guess that another thing that I also got recently when talking about antinatalism with another person is that at a certain point she told me, and she accepts antinatalism, but then she asked me, oh, but why is it then that Benatar and other people say that death is a harm? I mean, if life is so bad, why is death a harm? Basically, that was the question she posed to me. So what would be your answer?
Yeah, so before I answer this question, I've got to say that this is like a topic that is still open to me. I don't fully know how I view death, and I want to be honest and open about that, because I'm sort of pulled in both directions because I view death as bad and a harm, but I find it hard to understand if I'm making that evaluation based on death itself or the things that surround death, like the suffering of the dying process, the grieving that others do and stuff like that. And I'm still trying to understand in my mind if I can separate those two things out, which I think you can do philosophically, but I'm trying to understand my own beliefs on it. So at the moment, I still view death as a harm, as a bad thing. And I think for the ease of communication, even though that is what I believe, at least currently, when I'd be communicating antinatalism to someone, I think if I'm talking to the average person on the street, I would still communicate in such a way where if death comes up, I would I would take the position of death being a harm, because I think that is the average view that someone takes. And I don't think it's useful in a conversation about antinatalism, when you're trying to convince them about that one topic, to muddy the waters by introducing other controversial or even more controversial views. But in terms of what the person you were talking to said about, well, if life is so bad, then why is death a harm?
Yeah.
I can understand what she's saying, and life can be so bad that, like I said, someone may be better off dead, right? I don't think that necessarily means that, I don't think that just making an evaluation that life is bad necessarily means that death isn't a harm. It could just be a lesser harm than continuing existing. So you can still think that life is awful and death is better, but it doesn't mean that death isn't also a harm. Also, obviously, you've got to take into account that the bad things in life can be spread out. So I do think there are certain things in life that are bad that are pretty consistent all the way through life. But there are particularly bad things that can or will happen to people in life that are concentrated in particular periods of life. Often they can be towards the elderly years, but they can be other things as well. If someone goes through a period of deep depression, that may not necessarily be your age may not be relevant to that. So it could happen anywhere in your life. There are the children that affliction happens to, adults, more elderly people. So I can understand the sort of question that the person you were talking to, like where that's coming from, but I think it's a slight misunderstanding of the fact that you can hold one situation, i.e. existence, as very bad, but also that and that death is better, but also recognizing that death is a harm as well. But yeah, to bring it back to my own views, at the moment, I view death as a harm. I haven't quite figured out my intricate views on it. But yeah, that's my sort of overview.
But do you think that death is a harm? But do you think it's also a harm if someone decides for herself that death is the better way? I mean, that they just
Right.
want to exit life because it's unbearable or something like that. I mean, do you think that I understand that tendency that most people have to think that, oh, if that person suffered so much that they wanted to end their life and they thought it would be better to not exist anymore, then there's something wrong about the death itself. It doesn't sound right also because we are living beings, of course, and we have this sort of instinct to continue on living. But would you say that if someone said, "Oh, look, I've been here for I don't know how many years, and I've experienced this, and that, and they have this and that kind of problem. So for me, I think it's better to just not exist anymore. I don't know, commit suicide or seek medical help in the form of euthanasia or something like that." So in that specific case, would you still say that death is a harm?
Yeah. So the first thing I want to say is that identifying death as a harm doesn't necessarily mean that you would always advise people against it, of course.
Okay.
But yeah, in that instance, I do get what you mean. It's sort of difficult to see death as a harm because, at least in that instance, it seems like it would be the only thing that can release you from the bad situation you're in. And especially if you're able to seek medical assistance in dying, like assisted dying or euthanasia, and you're able to achieve an end of life that is painless, and you essentially like drift to sleep and just never wake up. It is hard to see how that could be a harm. I guess the only thing I could say in support of it being a harm is that presumably if the individual were able to of course, this is a hypothetical. This is not like going to happen in reality, or I don't know, maybe there are some instances. But if someone is in a terrible situation where they see death as the only practical way out, if someone like that were able to very easily change their conditions such that they would then pivot to having quite a good life and move on from the situation they're in, I would presume that at least some of the people would take that option over ending their life, because both of those options would release you from the current suffering condition you're in. So I guess in that way, if there is an option that would be taken by someone, but it's not available to them and death is the only option, and that's why they're taking death, then perhaps we could still see death as a harm, as it's sort of like they are taking it maybe even enthusiastically, but it's under coercive conditions, I guess. Not coercive from another person, but just coercive from the sort of nature of their existence at that point in time. But yeah, I'll have to think about it more if death is a harm in that specific condition, because maybe it wouldn't make sense to call it a harm. I'd have to think about it some more.
Yeah, and let me ask you about another kind of argument that many times antinatalists bring to the table, and actually this one, at least in my perspective, is one of the most compelling arguments. What do you think about the argument based on consent? I mean, the idea that we can't really get consent from, for example, a fetus before it is born. We can't really ask the fetus or the baby, do you want to be born or not? Do you want to have a life or not? I mean, do you want to exist or not? Do you think that tends to be a strong argument? Do you have any experience, for example, using that argument when talking with someone who is not convinced by antinatalism or not?
Yeah, so personally, I do find that argument convincing, as well as the others we've spoken about. In terms of it being convincing to other people that I've sort of spoken to about it, I think if someone is already relatively open to antinatalism as a general idea or viewpoint, they tend to find the consent point also convincing. I wouldn't say that I have had many conversations with people where they've not been convinced by multiple arguments for antinatalism, and then I present the consent one and they're like, oh, okay, that one's convinced me. Generally, someone is either sympathetic to the position or not, and the consent argument is just sort of like an additional argument to convince them. But I haven't found that if someone is generally not sympathetic to antinatalism, they then find the consent argument specifically convincing. Maybe there are some philosophers that that are like that because they're thinking about it in a philosophical way, and they sort of find the nuances of the consent argument much more convincing. But if you're talking to, or in my experience, talking to an average person on the street, I don't think the consent argument has any particular power over or sort of influence over people that any of the other arguments may not have. That being said, there are sort of like two misunderstandings that I found like people have quite commonly about the consent argument. The first is that people sort of rubbish the argument by saying, oh, well, this is a non-point because they don't exist to be able to get consent from them. So it doesn't make sense to talk about consent, which for me, I've never understood that pushback, because that's the whole point, is the fact they don't exist for you to get consent from them is the whole point. So referring to that as a way to push back to the argument, well, that is the argument. Whether or not an individual exists, if you're going to do something that will impact them directly and significantly, and you can't gain consent beforehand, just like if someone is asleep at a party and they're passed out, you can't perform a sexual act on them, even though in that case they do exist, you still can't attain consent from them because they're unconscious, right? And so whether or not, that person is passed out at a party, or they're a newborn baby, and obviously they can't give consent because they're a newborn baby and they can't communicate in any meaningful way or even understand the concept of consent, or if an individual doesn't exist at the point in time you're talking about, if you're going to do something that's going to significantly impact them, like, for example, if I have a newborn baby in front of me and I sign a document saying that it's okay to perform a circumcision on them, personally, I would view that as unethical because you can't get the baby's consent. It doesn't matter if you're signing that document when the baby already exists or hasn't been born yet, because you know that the circumcision will happen to them once they exist. So to say, if someone were to come up to me and say, oh, well, you can fill in that form, it's fine, it doesn't make sense to talk about a baby and consent because the baby isn't born yet, that misses the forest for the trees, because the impact that will happen that is not consented to will happen once they exist. Then another thing I find that people misunderstand is that they sort of assume, well, maybe it's not a misunderstanding, but it's a pushback that I think isn't valid, is that many people will say, okay, well, we can't secure consent from someone to bring them into existence, but, the majority of people, once they have been brought into existence, they tend to look back on being brought into existence as like, they're glad they were born, right? And so they sort of give retrospective consent. I don't find that convincing, because I've actually just released a video about this on Stockholm Syndrome. I think once people are brought into existence, they suffer from all manner of biases that can lead them to accept a state of affairs where I think they shouldn't, or at least the consent they're giving is highly tainted by biases or a relationship to the person that's brought you into existence, which means you can't sort of make a rational assessment of the circumstances. And there's an example given by Heta Hayri in a book called, I think it's called The Limits of Paternalism. I reference it in the video I've just made on Stockholm Syndrome. And basically she says, if we're to accept this idea that people can, we can do something to an individual as long as once it all comes out in the wash, they retrospectively consent to it, well, that means that the government could just breed people into facilities and trade them as some sort of radical, as long as part of the training is to accept the condition that the government has put you in, right? Now, none of us would look at this situation and think that is ethical for the government to do. But if we're to accept this standard of, well, if someone retrospectively consents to something, even after there's been all manner of intoxicating influences, like, indoctrination, well, like, if we're to accept that as the standard, then we've got to accept the government being able to do things like this. So, yeah, I don't find the idea of retrospective consent particularly convincing. Also, just because, and I've done a video even on this idea of, like, the fact that most people are glad to be born doesn't mean that we can bring more people into existence. But it's just the fact that if you don't create them, there's no one missing out on the life that they would have consented to anyway, if you get what I mean. So yeah, that's what I'd say to that.
Yeah, and on that point, I totally agree with you that even when people react negatively to the argument and they say, oh yeah, but you can't really talk about consent from someone who can't give consent to because she doesn't exist yet or something like that, because that's the point, right?
Yeah.
That's what we're saying when we use that argument.
Yeah, they're just repeating the argument back to us rather than actually making a sort of counter argument. Yeah.
So we've already gone through, some of the most common arguments that antinatalists use to advocate for antinatalism. Do you think that there are, or not you think that there are, but what would you say are perhaps some of the most compelling arguments you've ever heard against antinatalism?
So I've never heard, for me, I've never found any of the philanthropic arguments put against antinatalism convincing. So just for anyone that's listening that maybe doesn't understand what that means. So generally, this isn't always the case, but generally people tend to break down arguments for or against antinatalism as sort of philanthropic or misanthropic. Philanthropic meaning the argument is concerning the individual you're bringing into existence, and misanthropic is essentially the impact of the person you're bringing into existence, whether that's good or bad. So the arguments we've been covering have all been philanthropic, but a misanthropic argument could be, for example, if you're going to create a human being, they are likely going to consume, many animals over the course of their life, and this is going to create, much suffering. There are a range of misanthropic arguments, but that's just an example. So I've never heard a philanthropic argument against antinatalism that has been convincing. The only arguments I've come across that have given me hesitation have been misanthropic ones about essentially making the case and there's a sort of variety of flavors that this will come in, but the basic point it's making is that if antinatalists had their way and we started to genuinely convince people to have less children, the world wouldn't. It's not practical that we would reach the antinatalist ideal of extinction. We would likely just make the world a worse place. And there are a whole variety of reasons that they give for that. It could be that more, empathetic or more intelligent people are going to adopt antinatalism, which I don't necessarily think is the case. But if that were the case, then it's going to mean that, the world left behind is going to be run by people who are more callous and maybe less intelligent. Another one is if antinatalism gets its way, humans go extinct or just have a massively reduced population, then wild animals will increase in number and there will be much more suffering in the world. Now, of course, there are a whole sort of variety of assumptions that are made by those arguments. People may see them as reasonable or unreasonable. I'm not saying I'm convinced by those arguments. Obviously I'm still an antinatalist, but I'm just saying that if one were to find, if you were to, the assumptions that those arguments make, which I actually think some of the assumptions may be true, some of them may be less well-founded. If they were to be true, then that argument that overall we're just making the world a worse place by preaching this philosophy, that has given me some hesitation. It hasn't gotten me to the point where I'm going to stop advocating for it, or I'm, going to have children of my own or not be an antinatalist. But they've given me hesitation and I've needed to think about it. And the philanthropic arguments that have been put forward, obviously I've thought about them, because otherwise it would just be me ignoring them. But I've not found any of them to give me real pause for thought. But the misanthropic ones, they've given me more hesitation.
Yeah. So now for a bit of a thought experiment. Let's say that someone approached you and she told you, look, I have a button here with me. If you press it, it will be as if you never existed. I mean, you will be wiped off existence and it would be as if you never even existed. Everything related to you and all of that, you will cease to exist, but everything related to everything that you did, every person you interacted with, no one will remember you. It will be as if you never existed to begin with. Do you think you would press the button?
It's extremely hard to answer the question in a rational way, because given the fact that I exist to press the button, I will be imagining in my head that it's basically a button that kills me. So it's very hard to. So I don't know how to answer the question, but I'll answer it. I'll answer it in a slightly different way. Yeah. So I find I'm sure you're aware of Emile Chiron. He's sort of antinatalist, sort of pessimist. So there's a quote from him which resonates with me a lot, which is something along the lines of, I do not hate life, nor do I desire death. I just regret being born. And that really resonates with me because I at least at the moment, don't hate my life. I have a pretty reasonable standard of living, and I enjoy my life. And I'm very lucky in that respect because I realize that many people today and throughout history, in fact, probably most people, have not been in that situation. I'm in a first world country with ample resources at my disposal. I'm not rich or anything, but I have like a supermarket down the road. How many people in history have been able to say they have a supermarket down the road and access to a modern healthcare system and stuff? So I'm in a pretty good situation at the moment. Obviously, things could change, but yeah, I don't hate life, and I don't like actively want my life to end. I don't desire death, which is why it's hard to answer that question about the button, because it's sort of, given that you exist to press it, it's sort of asking you if you'd want to end your life rather than never start it. But to sort of answer the question in that, in a philosophical, I don't know what if I would actually press the button, but in a philosophical sense, what you're trying to get at, I think, is, would you prefer not to have been born? I.e., would you press the button? In that case, yes, I think it would have been better if I'd never come into existence. Better concerning me. It would be a good thing that I'd have never come into existence. But I think that on like an intellectual level, not on an emotional level. Like I said, lament my life. I don't constantly think about, it would have been better never to have been born. Well, actually, I do think about that a lot because I run a YouTube channel about it, but I don't like actively think about it in a negative way about my own life. But I recognize that never coming into existence would have been better than coming into existence, if I can put it like that. So it's sort of like, yes, I'd press the button, but it would feel very much like I would be killing myself rather than never coming into existence. But I'd be pressing it for the not being born part of it.
Yeah, I admit that this thought experiment is a bit weird because I'm asking you if you would do something that is not the same as death. I mean, it's very weird. We would even need, metaphysically speaking, we would even need a new word for this, because it isn't exactly the same as death, but it sounds like death. So anyway, let me ask you now about, because as antinatalists, we are all against having kids, against producing new sentient beings. Have you ever come across an argument put forth by natalist people who are in favor of having kids, that is not based on selfishness? Because I haven't.
Yeah, well, I guess it depends what you mean by selfishness. So I've come across arguments people have made for having children that don't serve to further their own interests, but that doesn't mean I find them, just because just because an argument isn't selfish doesn't mean it's convincing, obviously. But so someone could make an argument about, like, I'm having a child to help prop up the welfare system so that elderly people can continue receiving care. Now, maybe you could say that's still selfish because that individual is going to become elderly, so they're propping up a system that they will in the future benefit from. So maybe it is still selfish in a way. I guess the answers I'm gonna give that are ones where I don't think they're selfish, although I still don't think that means they're convincing or good arguments, are related to veganism. There are probably other ones, but because I move in vegan circles, these are the ones that I'm familiar with. So it's quite common to hear in vegan circles from pronatalist vegans that we should have more children because it will help bolster the animal rights movement and make the world better for animals. Basically, we can achieve animal liberation quicker if vegans have lots of children. So whether that is true or not, we'll park to the side. Let's just assume that is true and they're not buying into a delusion, or buying into a falsehood. That I wouldn't say is a selfish reason to have a children. I wouldn't say that's a good reason to have a children, to have children, but I wouldn't say that was a selfish reason, because it's not based, they're not centering the reasons for creating someone around their own desires. They're centering it around trying to benefit another group of individuals. Now, it's complicated though, because whilst someone may espouse a reason for creating someone like that, deep down it probably is for selfish reasons that they're having the child, because it seems pretty ridiculous to me for someone who doesn't want children anyway to go, well, I really don't want children, it'd be a massive inconvenience, this is not what my preferences are, but I'm going to have the kid because I want to save a pig in a factory farm. That probably doesn't happen. I think people put forward certain non-selfish reasons to have children on top. They sort of stack them on top of their already existing desire to have a child. So I think when people have children, generally the core motivations are always selfish, but they may have like a garnish of non-selfish reasons on top. But again, that doesn't mean those reasons are convincing. It just, they aren't centered around their own interests.
Yeah. So let's say that I'm a transhumanist and I approach you and tell you, look, if we wait 200 more years, we will get to a point where we've been able to basically solve suffering. No one is suffering anymore. No one has any illnesses. Everyone, whatever happens in life, they experience it as positive. Do you think that if something like that would happen, it would justify us procreating for the next 200 years? And after that, life would be worth living and you would stop being an antinatalist?
So personally, I wouldn't think that justifies the procreation, just because those future generations didn't need to exist in the first place. I think I mean, I'm probably not going to say anything new that David Benatar hasn't said, but obviously he says that obviously those intervening generations will go through suffering just to achieve a future generation that we should be indifferent to creating. Because if they weren't to come into existence, no one would be deprived or harmed by that. Obviously, it's good if they do come into existence. It's good they have blissful lives. But in my view, that's not a reason to create them. The only additional thing I'd say is that utopias don't last forever. You can sacrifice those intervening generations to get to a state where everyone has blissful lives, but there's no guarantee that's going to last forever. You know, presumably to, in practice, get to a state where we all live amazing, blissful lives, certain forms of genetic manipulation, certain technologies are going to be needed. These things can always be corrupted. And so we can get to a point where everyone has blissful lives, but that doesn't mean history doesn't just move one way. You know, we don't just make progress in one direction and then we reach the pinnacle where there's no suffering. We can slip backwards, and there are many examples in history where there has been a slip backwards. And I would say even if you ignore the philanthropic stuff or the stuff that, you know, someone like Benatar usually talks about, like we should be indifferent or we shouldn't sacrifice the intervening generations, it's just the fact that like utopian thinking is very dangerous. Many people have been killed and tortured because of utopian thinking. And I think this is a form of utopian thinking that if only we can just get to this place, things will be okay. And I just don't think that's the case. Even if we do get to that spot, that sweet spot where technically people aren't harmed by coming into existence because they don't experience any harm, that doesn't mean that that's guaranteed to stay that way.
So I'm going to ask you now about one last topic, something that came to my mind right now. So what are your thoughts on extinctionism? I mean, do you also advocate for extinctionism? And what I mean by that is that, of course, if we are antinatalists and we don't want people to reproduce anymore, it would inevitably lead to the extinction of our species. But I'm asking you, apart from that, do you look at the potential extinction of our species and even eventually other sentient beings as something good itself?
So I've actually done a video specifically on this. So any videos I've mentioned, I can maybe send you a link if you put them. I don't know if you usually do this, but if you want to, you can put them in the description. So
yeah, and I will also link to your channel in the description.
yeah, thank you. So I think obviously there's a strong correlation between someone being an antinatalist and someone being an extinctionist, and some antinatalists sort of put their extinctionism to the forefront of how they advocate. So I don't think if you're an antinatalist, it necessarily means you have to be an extinctionist. Now, one thing I want to make clear is I think that a universe with no sentient life would be the best universe. But that doesn't mean that that's the universe I want to aim for now. Just because I think that universe would be better than the universe that we're currently in, like we're now in a universe where sentient life exists. And I kind of see it as a Pandora's box that's been opened and it's not going to go away. And so given that sentient life already exists, I don't think on a practical level or on a philosophical level, an antinatalist is committed to extinctionism. I'll start with the philosophical level, then I'll move to the practical. So if someone's an antinatalist, it simply means that they're against bringing new sentient beings or human beings, depending on their flavor of antinatalism, into existence. That doesn't mean they want all human or sentient beings to go out of existence. I can imagine a world where humans gain immortality through genetic manipulation or some technology. There are certain species of animal that are biologically immortal, but they can still die from disease and stuff, but they don't age to a point where they would die. So obviously it's possible, and perhaps someday humans will sort of engineer that into ourselves. Given I'm an antinatalist, I still think it'd be wrong to bring new humans into existence, but I'm not gonna campaign against someone who wants to become immortal. Obviously, if they become immortal and use their immortality to constantly create babies, then we've got an issue. But just their immortality in itself, I've got no issue with. It's their life. They do with it what they want as long as they're not harming others. So I think an antinatalist would have no inherent issue with immortality, but an extinctionist would, because an extinctionist wants the species or all sentient life to be gone, which would include not producing any more, and the ones who already exist need to go away. Now, whether that means waiting for them to die or killing them off, that's a question for the people who hold those positions. But personally, that's why I'm not a philosophical extinctionist, because once someone's here, if they have autonomy over their own life and they want to make decisions to prolong their existence, I got no issue with that. That's their decision. And that's not for me to get involved in. So that's the philosophical side. The practical side, I don't think antinatalists should be, I don't think we should hide away from a conversation about extinction. If someone wants to bring it up, then, it's a free place. People share their views. If someone asks me, I will give them my opinion, like you've just asked me now. I'll give you my opinion. But I don't think conversations about extinction should be the predominant thing that we go to when talking about antinatalism, for a couple reasons. One, again, I think it just buys into utopian thinking. Like, it's so far-fetched and out there and far away. We as individuals now have no real influence over whether the human race is going to go extinct or sentient life is going to go extinct. And if we it just elicits an emotional response from people so that they go, oh, you want extinction, and use that to disregard everything you've said. If you stay on the topic of antinatalism, one, even though it's a bizarre concept to many people, it's probably less alienating than you saying you want everything to go extinct or everyone to go extinct. And if you keep the discussion on antinatalism, you're keeping it on something that they have direct control over. The person you're talking to has no control over whether the human race goes extinct, but they have full control over whether they have a child, removing any other circumstances of, forced pregnancy and stuff like that. Generally, if someone has control over their reproduction, then they have full control over the decision you're talking about. So yeah, and there was another thing I was going to say, but I've forgotten it. But I think those are some sort of like, yeah, there's a philosophical reason I'm not an extinctionist, and there's a practical reason why I think we shouldn't make that a predominant message in our advocacy. And also, let's be honest, antinatalists are a very small group of people who don't have significant power in society. We probably never will, because of the inherent biases in humans from our evolution. So trying to achieve extinction, I just think, is making the perfect the enemy of the good type thinking. And what we should really focus on is what tangible goods can we do with our time and resources that we have now while we exist, and try and do that. So yeah, that's what I'd say. If there's anything else you wanted to explore with extinction, then please ask me. I don't want to hide from anything.
No, I have one more question, and this will be my last one, but also related to extinctionism, because there are people that, when they are confronted with the idea of human extinction, they react in a negative way, because they say that as humans, just by existing, we bring value into the universe in a way, right? Because we can create art, we can learn about the universe, we can do science and all of that stuff, that without us, specifically as humans, there wouldn't be anything like that anymore. I have to say that it sounds a bit weird, that kind of argument to me, because when you're saying that it seems like you're saying that the universe has interests, that the universe itself is sentient, and it would lose something if we weren't here. But you yourself, do you think that it makes for a compelling argument at all?
I don't personally, just because art, science, literature, these sorts of things that this type of argument points to, those only serve to benefit sentient beings once they exist, right? Like, I don't think, the scientific method is an extremely good tool to use for us to understand the universe. But if there are no sentient beings in the universe, that tool has no use, because there's no beings in existence to have interests that can be furthered by that tool. The same with the piece of art. The Mona Lisa is something that we can appreciate as an amazing work of art, or if you don't like the Mona Lisa, pick some other work of art. But if there is no one to experience the Mona Lisa, the value is kind of lost of it, because there's no beings in existence to experience value. So yeah, I also find them uncompelling. I don't know if you heard, I'm sure there's multiple people who have put that argument forward, but I'm currently reading Should We Go Extinct? In fact, it's just there on my bed.
It's by Todd May.
Exactly, yeah. And I think, I've read like several books on antinatalism, for and against. I think it's in this book he puts that argument forward a bit. But yeah, I don't find it convincing.
There's even a sort of long-termist version of that argument, where some people are claiming that even if we have to make I don't know how many people suffer until we get, that is the same sort of argument I was mentioning earlier. Even if we have to go through another 1,000 years of making people suffer, we should be here until we get to a point where people can become immortal. And for me, that's just an horrendous argument, because how many people would they be willing to sacrifice just to get there? Right?
Yeah. Yeah, it's the same with many things. You'll have it with utopian thinking of all types. Like,
Yeah.
if we kill this many people because they are dissenters, pun intended, then we'll be able to get to this perfect political system, whether it is anarcho-capitalism or communism or whatever utopia you want. As long if we just hide these people away and kill them off, because they're ruining it, then we can reach this utopia. And it's the same sort of thing, if we just get through this many generations where these people are going to suffer, then we can reach this utopia. And it's just I think utopian thinking, like, there will be things to aim for and get to which will be valuable, but when you get to the point where you say we need to get to it at all costs, and you think the thing you're getting to is going to solve all problems, then you probably need to check, your you need to recheck things.
Yeah. Great. So just before we go, apart from your channel, which I will be linking to down in the description, are there any other places on the internet that you'd like to point to where people can find you, or some antinatalist advocacy groups, something like that?
Yeah, so anything I'm going to mention is linked somewhere on my channel, but there's my channel. There's a series I do called Antinatalism Around the World, where I talk to antinatalists in different countries. That is also available as a podcast on any podcast platforms. I also run a website called an Antinatalist Handbook, which this is linked on my channel, but it covers common arguments people give against antinatalism. It gives responses to those. There's a sort of antinatalist / effective altruist organization / website that at the moment it's just me running, called Antinatalist Advocacy. There's some good information on there, and charities that are relevant to this topic people can donate to. And hopefully I haven't missed anything. I think that's everything. Anything where I am, it's linked on my channel, so people will find the links there.
Okay, great. So look, this has been a very fun conversation. I was looking forward to this for a while now, and I've followed your channel for quite some time now. I really love your videos, so thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you for having me on.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, learning and development done differently. Check their website at enlights.com, and also please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Per Ergo Larsen, Jerry Mullerens, Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Forrest Connolly, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Phil Kavanagh, Mikkel Stormir, Samuel André, Francis Fortiago Nunes, Fergal Kossen, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Labyrinth, João Linhares, Stantantia, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardas France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correia, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavlo Stasevski, Nelek Baka, Madison, Gary G. Alman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yeager, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Ponce Cortez, Ursula Litsky, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Loaki, Georgios Theophanos, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Maury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry Dealey Jr., Old Erringbone, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dovner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandon, Nicholas Carlson, Ismail Benzliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Per Crowley, Kate Van Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, B.R. Masood Ali Mohammadi, Perpendicular, Jonas Hertner, Ursula Goodenough, Gregory Hastings, David Pinsoff, Sean Nelson, Mike Lavigne, and Dios Necht. A special thanks to my producers, Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Ignik, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, John Carlo Montenegro, Alnick Ortiz, and Nick Golden, and to my executive producers, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, Bogdan Kanivets, and Rosie. Thank you for all.